So, hello everybody, my name is Filip Polak, I'm the Director of United for Intercultural Action, and I'm joined here today with a human rights lawyer who decided to press charges against himself for a new amendment into the Slovak Criminal Code, which sees infringements to the freedom of speech and also reinforces notions of collective guilt among the country's ethnic minorities. It is my pleasure to welcome János Fiala-Butora, a human rights lawyer, researcher, and lecturer at Galway University. János, thank you so much for making time for me.
Thank you, Philip, for the invitation.
Pleasure's all mine. So first of all, before we get perhaps into the technicalities of said amendment to the criminal code, perhaps it's useful to introduce the subject a little bit more in the background, so people who would not be previously familiar with the sentiments that are being forbidden to be questioned can have an understanding of what we're talking about. You have been researching and also taking on cases that would entail possible issues about the Slovak state's handling of minority rights in the past. In your quick summary, how could you capture a little bit of a background when it comes to the decrees of Eduard Beneš after the Second World War and why they're concerning today?
Yes. Yes, it is a bit of a complicated question. So we have to start in 1945 when the Second World War ended. So at that time, President Eduard Beneš, President of the Czechoslovak Republic, issued certain decrees which restored the state, reconstituted Czechoslovakia as the state of Czechs and Slovaks, and some of these decrees punished the Hungarian and the German minority collectively. And the main aim was expulsion, complete expulsion of Germans and Hungarians, but this was not successful in the case of Hungarians. So all the Germans were expelled, but most of the Hungarians remained in Slovakia. However, these decrees deprived them of citizenship, of property. 40,000 were sent to forced labor, and there were some other harms caused by these decrees, which were all based on the principle of collective guilt. So it was not aimed at people who specifically acted against the interests of the state or committed war crimes or anything like that. These were ordinary people who didn't commit any crimes. Those who did commit, they were prosecuted individually. But the decrees we are talking about, they were targeting people who were not guilty of anything. This period lasted until 1948, when the citizenship of those Hungarians who remained in Slovakia was restored, but their property was not. So formally, they lost all agricultural property. Many lost their houses, their homes, without any compensation. So now we make a big jump to 1991, when Czechoslovakia adopted a law on restitution of property confiscated during the communist regime. At that time, Hungarians asked that also property confiscated under the Beneš decrees would be returned, but it wasn't. But at that time, we thought about the decrees only as a question of historical injustice. The question was compensation. The state's official position was that this was an unfortunate period. We are not proud of it. It's not to be discussed, but nothing can be done about it. However, the decrees are no longer used. That's how we all understood them. I studied law in Slovakia, so that's people genuinely believe that this is the case. And only later, as a lawyer, I came across cases where it turned out that Slovakia is currently using these old decrees to confiscate property from current owners. So property which was owned by Hungarians and Germans between 45 and 48, and is currently owned by their descendants, is now confiscated by the state relying on these old decrees. So they're essentially applying the principle of collective guilt now. And of course, I don't have to emphasize why this is very problematic and also absurd. So at that time, in the past, human rights treaties did not exist yet. The European Convention on Human Rights was adopted in 1950, and Czechoslovakia ratified it in 92, sorry. But now we have human rights treaties applicable, which do not permit the application of the principle of collective guilt, and also the right to property is now protected in international human rights law. We also have EU law, which doesn't allow for the principle of collective guilt to be applied. So there are many international legal obstacles why currently this should not be happening. And the state is aware of that. Yet these cases are taking place. So that is the reason why these confiscations are taking place very often in secret, in administrative proceedings where they do not notify the owners, and why the state is very much trying to suppress all kind of discussion on these issues. They are still, for a long time, they were holding on to the official position that there are no confiscations taking place currently, but now I think they admit that, yes, these confiscations are taking place.
My apologies to jump in, but before we get into the truly present day, I want to add a little bit of perhaps also additive context into the big summary that you just gave us, because first, the decrees themselves during this time that you described also involved the deportation of people to forced labor camps, which included children and elderly, deportations themselves under the population exchange program, the withdrawing of citizenships under the re-Slovakization issues, and as well as the seizing of assets and real estate in particularly. As for this, you, within the writings and within the interviews that you've been doing in Hungarian and Slovak, you note that since 2018, these proceedings that you later described are more or less enforced systematically under the shrine of basically a real estate mafia, as you chose to describe it within a free translation into English. So tell me a little bit more into depth as into why this happened so lately, and why there's such an emphasis on these issues. Because as you note also in previous texts, there is thousands of cases that involve the Beneš decree's enforcement in these disputes, 300 to 500 being rather serious. And of course, we can then also a little bit go into the key issues that you also brought over to the European Court of Human Rights to Strasbourg.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, for a long time, everybody believed that these decrees are no longer in operation. They cannot be applied anymore. But I think we don't know exactly what happened. But after 2000, obviously some civil servants who are administering state property and or some criminal circles found out that the decrees could potentially be used because they are still in force. I don't think there was any state demand behind it, so it was not organized by the government. Some people simply realized that because the state hadn't properly closed these issues or this problem, it can be abused by them. So there is monetary interest involved, and there is also a nationalistic interest. These overlap. There are civil servants who are doing this, best I can tell, with a nationalistic purpose, but they're also cooperating with criminals, yes, who we can call property mafia, who are interested in acquiring property for as little money as possible. Of course, they use many other methods. This is just one of them. So their interest is is monetary gain, and this meets the interests of some civil servants who are perhaps also benefiting from this financially. We don't know, but they're definitely also going after property which doesn't have much value. So it's not just monetary interest.
For a quick question on also how much it was noted that the Beneš decrees themselves would not be enforced in the present day. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this was also paramount in Slovakia's EU accession talks, if I'm not mistaken, because the decrees themselves were always deemed to be a violation to possible EU joining, but were perhaps dismissed because they would not be enforced.
Yes, that's correct. We have to understand that even if the decrees are not in force, they are still problematic. So there are scholars who are saying that even at the time between 48 and 45, they were not in principle in line with international law. So they are a problem even then. And Germans and Hungarians and Austrians were asking for the decrees to be repealed for a long time. So when the Czech Republic and Slovakia were joining the EU, there were objections raised both from Germany and from Hungary to countries being accepted to the EU which have the principle of collective guilt in their laws. And the EU commissioned a study which didn't resolve the matter, but they concluded that the decrees are no longer used, they are no longer applied. So as a historical matter, they can be problematic, but the EU doesn't have competence over these historical matters. So whether they were right or wrong in the past, it's not for the EU to decide. The EU can only say that because they are no use currently, they do not breach EU law. And this is what's being, this position is being challenged now when we are seeing that the decrees are used currently. So very likely they constitute a breach of EU law, and they undermine the legal position which was the basis for Slovakia's accession to the EU. So the stakes are very high. We don't know what follows from it. I mean, nobody wants to exclude for Slovakia from the EU, but based on what we are seeing, they could not have been accepted to the EU. Definitely not based on the legal position they were accepted with.
And I mean, there is also precedence by EU not to challenging it with EU law, but with Council of Europe initiatives through the case of Miklós Bosics. Could you tell me a little bit about this case and to everybody who would not be familiar with it?
Yes, that was the case which made the whole problem very public. It's a very symptomatic case. So it shows how these confiscations are working currently. And it was decided by the European Court of Human Rights. So the grandfather of Mr. Bosics, also called Miklós Bosics, he was a Hungarian who lived in North Slovakia. So he lived in Slovakia during the Second World War. And after the war, they wanted to confiscate his forest on the basis that he was of Hungarian ethnicity. And the confiscation process started, but they didn't finish it for unknown reasons. Simply there was no time to finish it until 48, when the communist takeover nationalized all agricultural property. So there was a process which started, but he formally remained the owner in 48. So in 1991, he asked for that forest to be restituted to him. And the state examined his claim, and they said, yes, it's his. It was not confiscated from him. So he became the rightful owner again. When he died in 2005, his grandson, Miklós Bosics, also inherited that forest, and the state approved his right to property. And later, suddenly, the state initiated a lawsuit against him, arguing that the forest actually belongs to the state because it was supposed to be confiscated in 1946. courts of first and second instance rejected that claim. They said, well, maybe it could have been confiscated in 1946, but it wasn't, so it's rightfully his. So we had a final decision, but then the prosecutor general intervened. He submitted an extraordinary appeal on points of law to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that even though the property was not confiscated in 46, we have to treat it to respect the authority of the state in this area, which is a very strange legal basis, as if it had been confiscated. In other words, it instructed the lower courts to confiscate the property to make the state the owner. And this is the case we took to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which dealt only with the procedural aspects and it condemned Slovakia. It found a violation because the prosecutor general intervened in the case which was already final and closed, and the Strasbourg Court found that there were no reasons to intervene in a closed proceeding. But based on this, the case was returned back to the Slovak courts, and they should close it with the then final decision, which said that Miklos Bosic is the owner of this forest. And the Supreme Court refused to do that. So last year, they rejected the Strasbourg Court's decision, and they're again insisting that the property should be confiscated. So the case will probably again return to Strasbourg. But this was important because it was the first international decision which describes how the process is going on, and everybody can see that, yeah, the state is trying to confiscate property now. 2013, I think, is the Supreme Court decision, or 2015. Trying to confiscate property now on the basis that the owner in 1946 was Hungarian. That's the legal basis for the confiscation.
Thank you very much. And to also add a little bit on context on how recent these things are within developments, you also had property disputes on terrains where the border itself was shifted. So it's terrain that wasn't part of Czechoslovakia until very, very recently, which then also engaged in accusations of this kind, and also as recently as the possible construction of the Slovak highway line, that people were also applied to and realized that they were in these situations. So we have established the background of the decrees, what has actually happened 80 years ago, how it is more or less left in this ambiguity that it is technically not enforced until it is under these circumstances, as you demonstrated. So let's bring it into very present day. What is the amendment of the criminal code that you actually decided to speak out about, and why is it so important to commit this struggle to it?
We have to see that this problem, or when we became aware of this problem and we started talking about it, that has been maybe the last 7 years. And there wasn't, we didn't really receive much reaction. So there was no public outcry. The public didn't seem to care. And that all changed last year when the largest opposition party, Progressive Slovakia, made a statement in which they said that the current confiscation of these properties is problematic and it shouldn't happen. And that elicited a hysterical reaction from the government coalition. And they reacted by amending the criminal code, introducing a new crime, according to which denying or questioning the peaceful settlement based on the acts of the representative organs of Czechoslovakia, which is the Beneš decrees, will be punishable by up to half-year imprisonment. In other words, you cannot question the Beneš decrees. And in their mind, this was directed against Progressive Slovakia, who was speaking up on this issue. But obviously, it's mainly Hungarians in Slovakia who are most speaking up against the Beneš decrees because they were directly affected. Practically everybody has people in their family who were affected. and they are very critical of it. So a lot of people got upset that suddenly the government does not even continue with this practice of confiscations, but is also criminalizing speaking up against it, which is absurd. So the law is very unclear. We don't know what exactly cannot be said, what exactly are the acts which are prohibited. So what can you not criticize about the Beneš decrees? And also, like, all criticism of this kind is covered by freedom of speech. There are scholars, historians, among them Slovak historians, who are studying the Beneš decrees, and there isn't one of them who wouldn't be at least partly or partially critical of some of their aspects. So everybody is criticizing them, and suddenly it's a crime to criticize them in public. So does this apply to scientific conferences? Does this apply to the press, to demonstrations, classrooms? Apparently it does. So I think the aim of the government here was simply to silence the discussion. They didn't want to actually prosecute people. They simply wanted people to stay silent. And this was going to happen mainly because we saw that many people, especially Hungarians, are outraged by the amendment to the criminal code, but are afraid to speak up. So that is why we came up with the initiative to launch a petition. And the petition's goal is twofold or even threefold. So first of all, it calls on the government to abandon the practice of confiscations. We want them to stop this practice and to compensate owners. But the petition does it in a way which violates the provision of the criminal code. So we looked at what exactly is the government's position on the Beneš decrees, and they issued two declarations, one by the government, one by the parliament, in which they say certain things about the Beneš decrees. There are many factual mistakes in these statements, so we take issue with those, we correct them, and we call on the government not to apply the principle of collective guilt in the 21st century, but to base its position on human rights and the principles of international law. And this is the statement by which we breach the criminal code. So it's absurd in a way that you breach the criminal code by calling on the government to respect human rights. But we do. So we submitted a criminal complaint against us, two of my colleagues and myself. We are the organizing committee of the petition. So we submitted a criminal complaint against us. First, to get clarification from the public bodies, what exactly is the crime here? What are they prosecuting? And second, to shield people who signed the petition from being prosecuted, because until they are dealing with the criminal complaint against us, until that's resolved and they get some clarification from the courts or from the constitutional court on what the law says, how it can be applied, what exactly is the act breaching it, until then they will know they will not take further action against people who sign the petition. So the process against us is ongoing. The police is currently investigating. They already questioned us, and they questioned two of us, and our third colleague will be questioned next week. And then they will decide. The prosecutor will have to decide whether they reject the criminal complaint or they will indict us.
So thank you very much. You jumped quite ahead with things that I had still noted in here, but on the first note, on the utter vagueness of what it entails to question, and also the lack of clear hierarchy when you have contradictions within freedom of speech to the criminal code, and also the freedom to sign on petition. What is kind of the expected outcome from this legal, well, ambiguity that that doesn't really, currently, best to my understanding, doesn't indicate a clear legal pathway of proceedings?
Yes, that's a good question, because if we look at it from a legal theoretical perspective, I don't think any reasonable lawyer would say that we can be punished, because ultimately the criminal code, the provision of the criminal code, is contrary to the Constitution and contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights. There is freedom of speech in them, there is the right to petition, there is freedom of scientific research, and so on. These are protected rights, and the state cannot violate them without very compelling reasons, and they showed none here. So I think all constitutional law scholars or lawyers would agree that the law is unconstitutional. And they said so. So all constitutional lawyers who have spoken up so far, they indicated that the law is very problematic. And they were joined by, for example, 120 public prosecutors who issued a joint statement saying that they think the law cannot be applied and it's unconstitutional. So by all logic, ultimately the complaint should be rejected on the ground that the law is unconstitutional. However, by this logic, the law shouldn't even exist, because this is something which we already know, so it should not have been adopted. The Slovak government has various ways of abusing their power, so they might exert pressure on the public prosecutor and the police to continue with the investigation. And the Constitutional Court is also a politically motivated body. These are the factors which make it unclear or uncertain what the outcome would be. I'm quite confident that at the end, the European Court of Human Rights will say that the law cannot be applied. But whether somebody earlier will say it and how long it would take, we don't know.
Thank you. I mean, you clearly make a gamble out of it while also deciding to press charges against yourselves together with two of your colleagues. So what do you think is most likely to happen within the case that you decided to file against yourselves in this case?
It's a gamble in a way, but a gamble which I think we have already won, because the real gamble for the government was or their real interest was in not applying the law. They wanted to silence the discussion, and they achieved the exact opposite. So now, if there is an ongoing criminal investigation, their only options are either not applying the law, which would just reveal that they are not serious about it and they know fully well that it's a problematic law, or applying the law, punishing us, sending us to prison, and inviting international outrage. So even they know that they don't really have good arguments to do that. So now they are in a difficult position. So obviously, if they send me to prison, that's not such a huge win for me. But I still hope that there are many. There are still many public officials in Slovakia who can see how absurd the government's plan is, and they will not let that happen. I'm relying on the Constitutional Court, but also on the public prosecutors. Some of them will just say that the law cannot be applied for all the reasons we have just said, and they will stop the prosecution.
I will come back to your cases in a moment towards also closure of interviewing, but to jump back also, where because we talked quite a lot about real estate and property issues, where does this leave ongoing procedures after this adoption of the Criminal Codes Amendment, and what is to be expected to be the norm procedures for these after now the Criminal Codes enforcement or possible enforcement?
Yeah, so seemingly these are unrelated issues. So the Criminal Code Amendment should not affect property disputes. But that is also not that clear. The President of the Republic, Peter Pellegrini, when he signed the law, he said that the law doesn't prevent people from defending their right to property in court proceedings. But the President's word is not a source of law. It's just his opinion. So formally, people can breach this provision of the Criminal Code by defending their right to property in courts. I don't think the government wants to prosecute any of those people. That would be even further absurd. But it can happen. If you create legal uncertainty, you create a huge problem because nobody knows what the law means anymore. People often ask me, as a lawyer, can you tell me what the law means? And we actually often cannot. We can say what the law should mean if we interpret it logically, and that's what happens most of the time. But once you start to apply the law arbitrarily, nobody knows what the law means. It's really up to actions of certain public bodies, which only tells you what the law means. So in that case, the law will mean what the prosecutor will think it means and what the criminal courts will think it means. If the criminal courts will think that, yes, even people who criticize the decrees in a court proceeding where they are defending their property rights from confiscation, even statements in those proceedings breach the criminal court, then they will breach the criminal court. So it's a very dangerous action always to create these type of legal uncertainties, because that just leads to arbitrary application of law.
Thank you. What's I think also quite interesting to note about it that you have spoken previously about the fact that you know Robert Fico because he was also a professor of yours while you were studying law in Bratislava, and you mentioned that he would be a quite capable and quite good constitutional lawyer, at least on his awareness or knowledge of it. So I think what's also bewildering from the external is if you would want to gain political points by attacking a piece or creating a piece of legislation that attacks your opponents, in this case, the liberal, economically conservative PS, the Progressive Slovakia, why do it in a form of fashion that that creates such havoc also within the legal functions of the nation?
Yes, so you're correct on both points. I know Robert Fico because he taught me, and he's a good constitutional lawyer. So he was well respected in the profession. He wanted to become a constitutional court judge, so I'm sure he is fully aware of the problems his government has caused, but he doesn't have full control over what happens. So we have to see that this amendment of the criminal code was not a planned act. It happened very fast. Some government politicians affiliated with the government but not part of the governing parties came up with the idea. So they said, criticism of the decree should be criminalized, and then government MPs just try to preempt them by adopting this amendment very fast. And we know from the records that it was not the government itself, but a member of parliament who belongs to the government who introduced this amendment 10 a.m. in the morning in November, and by 5 p.m. it was adopted. So you can we have to understand that there wasn't much public debate or even expert debate on what the consequences are, what it means. I wouldn't be surprised if even the prime minister didn't know about it at the time. So it's a problem which he didn't create, but he failed to stop it by engendering those historical reactions to the statements of progressive Slovakia. So he's politically responsible for the problem, even if the problem can cause him legal problems and maybe condemnation by international bodies, of which he is aware.
In general, I think it's quite also interesting to see how political climate is developing as a consequence of this amendment, because it was, first of all, as you mentioned, also passed in very haphazard, quick fashion. The vote for approval, I think, happened the day before Christmas. And then protests were going on during Christmas and in the beginning of the new year. You, I think, also then decided to press charges against yourself as early as the 3rd of January in Komárno. So what does the political reaction to this law in general look now within the nation of Slovakia? And of course, there's a myriad of actors we can talk about also in a broader European perspective. But I think the main question on everybody's mind is where does Viktor Orban stand on this? He has been, has had an interesting relationship with the Hungarian minority, to occasional support, to occasionally supporting Romanian far-right candidates who very much do not support Hungarian ethnic minorities in the nations. Where does he come into the picture, if he comes into all? And how does it also evolve the possible augmentation of this conversation within Slovakia?
Yeah, so I don't see much public support to this law from the Slovak government side. They are mainly silent about this. And there is some public opposition to the law from the opposition side, mainly from Progressive Slovakia. But the most vocal are Hungarians from Slovakia. So their party, they're organizing a scientific conference which will breach the criminal code, and so there was a petition, and there are a lot of people are speaking out against it. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has been traditionally placing himself to the position of defender of the rights of Hungarians living abroad. But as you pointed out, on this issue, he has remained suspiciously silent. And that is because of his alliance with Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, which puts him into a very uncomfortable position. He cannot speak up against the decrees without jeopardizing his alliance with Robert Fico, and he needs Robert Fico in his dealings against the EU. So this was rightly pointed out by Viktor Orban's opposition, mainly Péter Magyar, who started to campaign against the amendment of the criminal code quite intensively, I would say. So in Hungary there were some demonstrations too, and Péter Magyar got into a communication with representatives of the Slovak government. He sent a letter to Prime Minister Fico, to which President Pellegrini replied first, to which Péter Magyar again replied. Robert Fico didn't issue a written reply, they just commented on it. But Péter Magyar uses all the opportunity to show why the decree is problematic. And he's probably doing that also to put Viktor Orban in an unfavorable light. But that's just the nature of politics, I think. He's doing that also to show that the law is really unacceptable. it's very early to tell what the consequences of that will be within Hungary, perhaps, whether this will have any impact on their electoral chances. We know that in April there will be parliamentary elections in Hungary, so this debate has already become part of the electoral debate. And what the consequences might be for Slovakia, where this question also plays a role in internal politics. So Progressive Slovakia is currently the most popular party in the country and is the biggest challenger to the government. And importantly, what consequences this might have for government policy. Will the government change their opinion on the law? Will they withdraw it? It's probably too early to tell. That's what I can say. But I hope on this latter point, the courts and maybe international bodies will also have a say.
Thank you. I think it's also important to note kind of an issue in regards to the enforcement of minority rights as just minority rights within this area, due to the historical past of revisionism, nationalism, it being used as a possible means to gain political points. We know that more often than not, Viktor Orban himself also resoluted to that. Also, both countries, unfortunately, have a rather big part of the population that would vote genuinely also to the far right-ier fringes onto the poll. Do you think that this issue that is currently being presented by the criminal code itself is able to be treated genuinely as a human rights / minority rights issue overall, or does it fall victim to the past of national revision and the tension between the two countries?
Well, that is also hard to say because depends by whom. So yes, certainly some actors, some segments of the population can treat it as a human rights issue, and especially the criminal code. So the amendment of the criminal code, I think it's easy to see, even for people who might not be sympathetic to human rights, it's easy even for them to see that, this is a serious problem. It's easy to imagine if you can criminalize this kind of speech, you could criminalize, many other kinds of speeches, and that should not happen. That's actually the reason why we have human rights treaties. But the government is not yet adopting that position. And obviously, they have their own followers as well. We know that in the background, there are ongoing discussions between the Hungarian government and the Slovak government on this issue. So that might lead to some changes in position, and that's not bad. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Obviously, it's a good thing if governments talk to each other, and at least they will have more information about each other's motives. Can that lead to, I don't know, withdrawal of the criminal code? Can that lead to some changes in the policy about confiscations? I'm more skeptical of that. We can see that the good relationship between Viktor Orban and Robert Fico has not yet led to any breakthrough in understanding minority rights or in shifting Slovak-Hungarian disputed questions from a nationalistic discourse to a discourse based on human rights. That has not happened. None of the problematic questions were resolved by Viktor Orban and Robert Fico. So I don't think this will be the first good example of that. I mean, their cooperation is mainly based on, an illiberal alliance against the European Union, but it doesn't really bring much benefit of this kind, of actually coming to some agreement on respecting minority rights and changing the discussion from a nationalistic to a human rights based one.
Do you think there's also a comprehension of this among not only just the broader participants who make up the political realms of power, but genuine consensus around population of wanting to treat this as a human rights issue? Because naturally, there's not just one ethnic minority within Slovakia. There is many minorities also within in Hungary. So it does set a very dangerous precedent for possible upheaval of power. And I think you also mentioned that minority terrains are kind of the canaries in the coal mines when it comes to testing abuses of power. Do you think there can be a universalized form about it within the Eastern Central European context? Or will it be ultimately colliding with the preset sentiments of nationalism?
That's hard to say, and yeah, I stand by that analogy. So even if you think about the confiscations, people would think this is the quintessential nationalistic issue because the decrees were targeting Hungarians and Germans as Hungarians and Germans. But the current application of the decrees is based on the idea that the state just doesn't have to respect property rights in certain situations which the state defines. So that has huge consequences for peaceful possession of property for anybody. So today they made up this exception. Tomorrow, if they defined the Slovak national interest in some other way, I don't know, contrary to environmental interests, and they just start taking over property without compensation based on that interest, a lot of people can be affected, and the precedent was already set and accepted here. That is why I think, and there are many more examples of that. So also the criminalization is a good example where, yes, maybe it only bothers Hungarians at the moment, but it shouldn't. It should bother everybody who thinks the freedom of speech is important and would like to say something freely without being afraid that the government might put them in jail. Because tomorrow, using the same principle, the government might criminalize other acts of speech. Again, relying on the Slovak national interest on which they define, and I don't know, they might say that advocating for LGBT rights is undermining the Slovak national interests, and people should go to jail for that. Or advocating for migrant rights. I just made up something, but I think these examples are not far-fetched. I mean, we are living absurd times, and illiberal forces are often quite imaginative about what kind of repressive measures they can learn from each other and what they can invent.
I mean, if your bet against the Slovak state on this particular motion also goes your way, the parallel that many journalists in Hungary have made, that this might be a similar outcome of a law that is not being able to be enforced and blows up in the government's face, the same way how, for example, the Hungarian government tried to ban Pride and created the largest Pride ever in Budapest held. Do you have also these kind of ambitions to make this somehow heard within the Slovak media consensus to popularize this genome within, or are you having more hopeful ambitions when it comes to possible European institutional / advocacy-led initiatives to countervene on this than perhaps popular support within the nation?
Absolutely, both. So I do hope that because the government made this such an important issue, there will be, and we can already see that there is interest among Slovak professional circles to discuss these matters, and there will be also interest in the media. And I also think this catches the attention of international bodies. So it actually helps any advocacy concerning the Beneš decrees, which I fully intend to use. So I don't know where it can take us, but the government has certainly helped us with giving sail to these winds, I think.
Has there been any European support of this initiative so far? Because of course we know that Hungarian independent publications of various sorts take interest, Hungarian-speaking publications within Slovakia themselves, also to some extent also Slovak media, Slovak-speaking Slovak media has been also engaged with following up the issue. Has there been any European response on this matter so far?
Not yet. So there are organizations, partner organizations, mainly of minority groups from other countries, Western European countries, who supported the petition and they signed it, but not from international bodies yet. So I think it will be slower. It will come later, but now the issue is on their agenda, and we will also publicize the petition and the results and what's going on in Slovakia with the international community and especially the international bodies. So again, early to tell, and some of them might think it's not their competence, but I hope that at least human rights bodies and with the support of international human rights NGOs will debate these issues.
Well, keep us posted on which areas you want to possibly proceed, and I think for as long as I'm still with United gladly provides it a platform to circle it about and also lose the stigma, because it's a personal experience, but more often than not, these type of minority issues are being kind of blended in of serving political gain at one point or another. So to have them as their own independent rights struggles, as a minority rights struggle or human rights struggle, is quite dear to my heart here, and I think should be also argumented about European, Eastern European, Central Eastern European human rights struggles as such. Last thing on just also the political the dimensions on it, because we've spoken about the Beneš decrees themselves not being enforced, or at least perceivably not being enforced at the time of an EU accession. And now we see that they are quite in use de facto, even if that de jure would be now a very questionable thing to possibly make. But that might be me incriminating myself accidentally here as well. Where does this leave the current circumstances? And would it be warranted to start something as an infringement procedure against the Slovak government under these circumstances, or is this super high-fetched in fiction just by ambition or just by not having enough factuality to measure into these cases?
No, it's not far-fetched. Yes, I think the conditions for an infringement proceedings are there, but we have to understand that the consequences can be huge. So I understand why the European Commission is also hesitant here, because it's a very large problem, and it's a question which undermines Slovakia's joining of the EU. And I don't think there is any appetite for excluding Slovakia from the EU. But if not that, then what? Should the EU accept the principle of collective guilt in the 21st century on the territory of the EU? I don't think they can do that. So they must insist on this practice being stopped. Can they really achieve that? Do they have the tools for that? If it's such a sensitive issue for Slovakia, or better or worse, that the Slovak government might absolutely insist on not changing their position. So I'm not saying that the EU shouldn't try or that the EU wouldn't succeed. I think they could, but I understand why they are careful, and they are probably carefully examining what exactly is going on and whether it's politically even feasible for them to intervene. We have to add that for a while, there has been mounting criticism of the EU and how the EU handles human rights matters, how they are selectively enforcing it. And I think that's a valid criticism. So a lot of political considerations go into where to initiate infringement proceedings and on what issues. And this is part of that package. So it's a very serious problem with very serious consequences, but not succeeding with putting pressure on Slovakia can also have very serious consequences for the EU's credibility. So it must be carefully considered.
I think until perhaps the ECJ's ruling against Hungary on violations for Hungary's migration policies that would be opposite or contradictory to the EU's policies, there was at least a dim hope that whereas often countries were lackluster in possibly introducing enforcement or compliance to the rulings of the Strasbourg Court, the ECJ would have more underlying powers on it. But we also see that on its own is also less of a legal motivation or a genuine thing that would foster the level of compliance that it, for example, may have in the past. So my question is also, if best case scenario also happens, like let's say the EU Commission does want to get involved, does want to pressure the Slovak government into a form of compliance through valid legal precedents at hand, and that would not include the expulsion of Slovakia out of the Union. Do you see chances of it actually being enforced? Because I think, well, as Donald Trump put it, right, like the only restraints on his actions is his own morality, and there is, I think, more and more challenges on what international law, union law might be worth in these circumstances under the hands of these illiberal theorems of statecraft that are developing throughout the recent past.
Again, it's hard to say. So obviously, yes, I see a chance for that being enforced. Slovakia usually complies with Commission sanctions or requests, and the EU has sanctions at its disposal, financial sanctions. Slovakia also has a volatile political scene. So if somebody would oppose the EU and would get sanctions as a result, that might lead to losing the elections, and the opposition might be very happy to enforce the EU requirements. So it's a bit different than, let's say, Hungary. So yes, I see chances for that, but there are many moving parts which are hard to assess in advance. It might even backfire. It can cause backlash. It might even strengthen the Slovak government. We have seen other governments opposing the EU and not implementing some EU requirements, and not only Central Eastern governments, some Western European governments also. So there is precedent for that too. That's all we know. How specifically this issue would play out, we don't.
János, thank you very much. Like final couple of questions at this point only. Back to the very centerpiece that I think started the conversations among many media publications is also your own proceedings against yourself, I guess, that you charged yourself at. You managed that the hearings have been already conducted between the two of you, and you only await now the hearing for a third of your colleagues. What are the possible steps to expect under the process that faces now, and how it has been dealt with under the current circumstances? Like, do you think everything in terms of process was satisfactory? Yes,
it was fine. The police were confused about how they should apply the law. So they didn't reject the criminal complaint. They will forward it to the prosecution after they have taken statements from all of us. and they will leave it to the prosecutor to decide whether to continue with the indictment or reject the criminal complaint.
Right. Well, once again, best of luck with everything. Hopefully, we will not see you end up being put to jail because of a petition. The petition will be made also available under this video that we'll post, together with its more than ambitious demands. But you mentioned that that might be a little bit far-fetched. And once again, thank you very, very much for making time for this. If there's anything else that you would like to possibly add into this conversation, please go ahead. If not, it was really a pleasure having you on, János.
Thank you very much, Philip. The pleasure has been all mine. And I hope members of United can also support the petition. Thank you very much.
Thank you.